My name is Geoff Millard. I am the chair of the National Board of Directors for Iraq Veterans Against the War. Iraq Veterans Against the War is a national organization of veterans who've served in the military since September 11th, 2001. And we, from the beginning, have opposed the war in Iraq and since have added Afghanistan. And we have stood against the war for immediate withdrawal of all occupying forces, for reparations for Iraqis and then Afghans as well, and also for full benefits for service members upon our return. I think to fully understand what Iraq Veterans Against the War has fought for, and we're about to go into our 10th year next year, and to understand what we fought for this whole time, you have to understand how we've developed over the years. So understanding that a few combat vets coming home from Iraq and thinking that we're just going to end a war, we always had this mentality that the next thing we do is going to end the war, right? So we came home and thinking that if people just knew what we went through and what we did, and that our experiences were inherently immoral in the war, that if people just knew those experiences, it would end the war. And so we became basically a speakers bureau. There were only a few members at first. There were 7 founding members, and it grew quickly to a handful, 50 members and 100, and basically would go out to college campuses, high schools, things like that, and just tell our stories, talk at anti-war rallies, things like that. And so for the first probably 2 years, we were just a speakers bureau. And then we started organizing our own events, mostly anti-war rallies, things like that. Then we started getting a little bit more creative with the events, but it was still just organizing our own events, but it was a little bit more creative. We started organizing our own street theater events. That's where it really kind of kicked off, and we started organizing what we called Operation First Casualties. And we actually organized our first one here in the District of Columbia, where we started organizing patrols. And Operation First Casualty, we would do street theater, which was combat patrols through around the touristy areas downtown. And we would have our actors, our civilian allies, would go and say stand in line like at the Washington Monument. And we would have our combat patrols in full uniform with our kind of hands like this as though they were rifles. So it was clear to any of the police, if they were monitoring, that we weren't like holding rifles. So we made sure we weren't like even holding toy rifles, because we were not trying to get shot. And we were very like specific and clear on that. But we would come up and we would roll up on them just like we would do to Iraqi civilians in Iraq. And we'd pull them out of line. We'd put hoods over their heads, zip cuff them, get in their face, yell at them, kick them to the ground, and drag them away, just like we might do to a military age male in Iraq. And tourists had no idea what we were doing. They would freak out. They would call the cops. They would have no idea what we were doing at all. And we did this while our folks were in line at the Capitol building, at the Washington Monument, down at the Lincoln, over by the White House, all these touristy spots. And what we were trying to do is just show a little bit of what the war was like for the average Iraqi. And we knew that you couldn't really show what the full war was like. But again, our idea was, well, if you just let people know what the war was like for real, if people just knew, the war would end. But when the war didn't end, we thought, okay, the next thing will end the war. So we started organizing bigger events. So then came Winter Soldier, our first big national event. We brought together over 250 members of Iraq Veterans Against the War, again, here in DC, actually. And we had over 100 members testify about our experiences in Iraq. And we put on this very professional testimony where we went through and we made the case that the problems in Iraq weren't a few bad apples, that it was actually policy. It wasn't that soldiers were going out there and going rogue and causing problems, that it was a matter of policy. That the problem with Iraq wasn't that a couple of soldiers were going out and causing problems, but that when you have an immoral war, you're going to have immoral results. And lo and behold, the war didn't end. So we had to rethink it again and start to realize that what we needed to do is start to organize our community and organize in a transformative model and start to look at veterans and service members as a community. And we started to look around at other models that might be doing this. And we really started to look at who might be allies in this. And that turned out to be critical. So we looked at what other communities started to at first look at what the small aspects of their struggle were and why they were falling short in their small struggle. So we looked at the coalition of Motley workers in Florida, who are migrant workers in Florida and day laborers in Florida. We looked at the United Workers in Baltimore, who clean the stadiums in Baltimore, and they're day laborers, and they unionized. They're the only ones in the country who've unionized day laborers, mostly undocumented workers. And we looked at them and said, they have a lot in common with the way that soldiers are treated, because soldiers are treated as though we have absolutely no rights. Service members are treated as though you can just be deployed even though you have post-traumatic stress, even though you might have been a victim of military sexual trauma, even though you have traumatic brain injury. You have no right to heal at all. You have no rights to your own body. You can just be deployed and you're disposable. And we looked at those coalitions of individuals and we said, we have a lot more in common with these undocumented immigrants than we do with most people who might look a lot more like us, but don't get treated like us. And so we looked at what their organizing model actually was, and it was this transformative organizing model. So we started to train with them, and we started to try and learn a lot more from the coalition of Motley workers down in Florida. And we started to learn a lot more from the United Workers in Baltimore. And we developed a model based on theirs, of this transformative model. And so that's where we are now, is working off that campaign model and actually treating veterans and active duty service members as an actual community. And it's something that I don't think any veterans group has really tried to do with us as a community and looked at this as a community before. So to understand our campaign, you have to understand our journey first and know where we've gone from being a speakers bureau and a couple of members just trying to tell our stories to viewing ourselves as a community and organizing ourselves to transform and really mobilizing our power base to do that. When we looked at trying to actually mobilize that base and how to do that, the first thing that we have to do is listen to our base, right? We have to say, what are the things that our base needs? And the big thing that we realize is that nobody listens to service members. I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric out there about supporting the troops, and you see the yellow ribbons and you see the benefits and stuff, but no one actually listens to service members on a real level. It's a community that no one actually hears. So creating a platform that service members can actually be heard is something big. So we started with a listening project to actually have our allies in the Civilian Soldier Alliance, as well as members of Iraq Veterans Against the War, listening to service members. And it sounds like something really trivial, but it took a lot of work at actually active duty bases, spending a lot of time listening to service members and taking those concerns and compiling them in a real way that we had data that we could use to actually then challenge the military-industrial complex on what our needs were that weren't being met. And what those needs were, it turns out, were that we were being redeployed time and time again with real trauma. 1/3 of service members that are deployed today in Afghanistan are deployed on psychotropic medications. That means they have diagnosed trauma and they're still being redeployed. These are service members that are being redeployed with automatic weapons into a place that's arguably the most traumatic space in the entire world, and being asked to make life and death decisions over civilians who may or may not be trying to kill them. This is probably not a good space for anyone to be in, let alone someone who's on psychotropic medications. So these are the space that we're now fighting in, is that right to heal for those individuals. Then our Chicago chapter started working with the nurses in the VA hospitals, the veteran hospitals, on increasing the number of nurses per patient in those hospitals, because we started to recognize that the patients inside the VA weren't always heard the way that they could be heard, and those nurses weren't heard the way they could be heard. So we started pairing the caregiver with the patient there in a really much more active way. Again, creating that alliance there and working on building that power, but it comes from giving voice to those individuals, and that's where we found really created and mobilized that base of power. But it started by realizing that we were actually a community, and it was something that I don't think had really been done before from the veterans community, other than in a very lip service sort of way. I would have to say that the biggest challenge that veterans face is the trauma that we come out of the military with. Most people don't realize that the military really is basically trauma thrown at you constantly. It's overwhelming violence, it's overwhelming trauma, especially when you're talking about being deployed to a combat zone. But even if you're not, I mean, women in the military are raped at a 1 in 3 rate. You've got sexual violence at a rate that sexual harassment is a rate at an unheard of level, and at a rate that can't be challenged, unlike in a civilian job setting. It's not like a woman in the military can just walk away. She can't quit her job. That's going AWOL. You can be prosecuted and thrown in jail, like some of our members have done. Been thrown in jail because they tried to just leave after being sexually assaulted. So you've got this trauma that's being thrown at you, and you don't have this right to heal. And now when you get out, you've got this trauma, you've got this this military culture that you're still trying to figure out how to deal with, and then you're trying to organize on top of that, and trying to figure out how to deal with your own issues that you might be dealing with. And I think trying to persist through that is the biggest hurdle of trying to deal with it. I mean, I collect disability for post-traumatic stress and being disabled from post-traumatic stress. And how do you figure out how to keep organizing when you have suicidal tendencies? Like, how do you keep organizing when you feel like, you have nightmares from the war? And that can be some of the toughest part. But in building that power base and starting to create this community, that actually helps to mitigate some of those things. So the fact that Iraq Veterans Against the War even exists helps to mitigate some of those factors. The fact that, unlike other veterans who come out of the military and all of a sudden there's no community that exists, I have a whole phone full of phone numbers of people that I can call up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when the nightmares get too much and I don't think I can take it anymore. There's an entire list of phone numbers that they will answer at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, and I don't even have to think twice, and no one judges me for picking up that phone. The fact that in DC alone, there's dozens of members that live here that will come over to my house at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning and not think twice and just hang out, because they know how difficult it is to deal with post-traumatic stress in the middle of the night and still try and organize and do all this stuff. So the fact that we have created this community, I think, is what helps us persevere through some of those more difficult times and bring some of those things that we've dealt with in the military. Now, is it always perfect? No. Have we made mistakes? Yes. Have we made every mistake possible? Probably. But our suicide rate is a heck of a lot lower. I can count on one hand the amount of suicides we've had inside of IVAW. That's not the case for the military. That's certainly not the case for veterans at large. 22 veterans kill themselves every single day, and I can count on one hand how many IVAW members have. Well, again, if we look at what's happened with the Coalition of Motley Workers and with the United Workers in Baltimore, these campaigns aren't just about getting a couple dollars more an hour. They're not just about getting recognition of a union. They're not just about getting a transaction. It's not just transactional organizing. It's about transformative organizing. And that's more of what we've taken on. And so realizing what other movements have been able to accomplish has been critical for what Iraq Veterans Against the War has done, but also having direct mentorship. I wouldn't be here if I didn't have the mentorship of David Klein, of Vietnam Veterans Against the War, of Veterans for Peace, of an entire generation of veterans who have come before, who came home from wars and said, I'm not going to fight in these wars anymore, and I'm going to end the war I just fought in. If we didn't have that, none of this would be possible, certainly not as quickly as we were able to stand up and start working. And I think that the fact that we've had mentorship has meant a lot. And the fact that we've been able to make mistakes without completely falling apart has been important. Mistakes are really important to the development of any individual. They're critical to the development of an organization. And the fact that Iraq Veterans Against the War has been able to make honest mistakes and not completely fall apart as an organization, and that there has been organizational and institutional support around us to allow for us to make mistakes, is really important. In 2008, when the markets collapsed, a lot of nonprofits failed. IVAW didn't. And we didn't fail because even though we made mistakes in that time period, we had organizations around us to help us through that time period. And if it weren't for that mentoring type relationships that we had, we would have failed. There's no doubt in my mind about it. But because of our relationships to the movements and to other organizations, we were able to persevere through that time period in a way that I think we're now stronger because of it. As someone who moved to the district from the outside, I came here in 2006 because there was no chapter of Iraq Veterans Against the War. And the challenges of the anti-war movement in the district are, I think, mirrored to the challenges of the district. The fact that the district is getting whiter, the fact that people are coming from the district, and we're seeing a lot of gentrification. We're seeing a lot of that same thing happening in the anti-war community, right? The anti-war community is overwhelmingly white, even though the attitudes of the black community are just as anti-war as the white community. In fact, more so, but yet we haven't been able to mobilize that base. Why? Like, why is that? Why is it that the leadership base of IVAW is overwhelmingly white, even though service members are not overwhelmingly white, even though war resistors are not overwhelmingly white, even though veterans are not overwhelmingly white? It's an issue that we see replicate itself time and time again, and so those challenges are not unique to the district, but yet seem to be reflecting in the problems that we see and in the challenges that we see happening within that gentrification in the district. And I think that a big part of it is that we get caught up in what we're doing, right? So when I came here, I was so concentrated in my own little world of like, I'm gonna end the war, and I didn't see all of the other issues facing the district. It took me years before I even knew what the Wilson building was, and before I understood what statehood issues really were. Like, it was easy to see the license plate and understand on a very like topsoil issue of taxation without representation. But what does that really mean? How does that really affect the budget here? And how does that really affect local tax issue? And now that I work here, and I have for years, and now that this is actually my community, it's really very different. And so part of that also in understanding what's going to happen next with the next person coming in to take over, as like, I started the DC chapter of IVAW, but if I choose at some point not to live in DC, who's going to be the next leader of that chapter? is it going to be someone who comes in from the outside, or is it going to be someone who grew up here, and is that local influence? And I think it's really important for me as someone who cares about my community to make sure that I'm developing local leaders. And it's important to look and take a lot of time in a mentoring role and look at local leadership and say to myself to make sure that I'm being very particular about what local leadership looks like and how I can develop local leadership in a very meaningful way, and that we can question and push back against some of the things that are happening in the district, and do that in a positive way. And it doesn't have to be we can challenge that without it being negative. There's a lot of resources in the district that that we don't think about every day, that especially when you're here doing anti-war work, that you don't even think about, especially as a soldier. Like, I got arrested one time at the Pentagon for handing out literature about depleted uranium, and I didn't even think about that as a resource, but the fact is that no one else had that opportunity to get that kind of message out about depleted uranium, and I did. The fact that the National Press Club is here, the fact that there's a focused attention here, the fact that there have been a lot of events here because we have that kind of focused attention. But at the same time, it comes with a unique set of struggles, because a lot of national events end up coming here, and sometimes I haven't wanted to work on that. I've wanted to work on local things, and it's forced me to end up organizing national events when I've wanted to organize local things. I've wanted to work with Empower DC on a local campaign, or the local Jobs with Justice on something that I felt like was really important to organizing the local veteran power base, and was really important to organizing veterans as a community here locally. And I've almost been forced to work on other things because, well, there's this national march happening, and a bunch of vets are about to chain themselves to the White House fence. And yeah, I don't believe in it, and I think it's actually kind of stupid, but a bunch of our members are coming in from all over the country, so I gotta end up organizing it, otherwise I look like an idiot. And I don't really feel like working on this, but I have to. I'd much rather be working with Jay on this janitors campaign, because we got a bunch of vets who are actually janitors at this building here, and their work is way more important than a few vets who want to chain themselves to this White House fence. But that's what I end up working on, and so it becomes the struggle of national priorities versus local priorities that I feel like other places just don't get, right? They don't understand what ends up happening here in the district because of that. And that sometimes can be a resource and an asset, and other times can just make me want to choke people out. Like, it can be so just maddening. Sometimes you just have to push back at national leadership. And now I chair the board, so I have a lot more power to push back at national leadership, because I'm in a very strong position nationally. But when I was just a chapter leader, sometimes you have to push back and say, no, I'm not going to do that. If you guys want to come here and do that, you're going to have no local support. And over time, you have to push back and get some respect nationally from that. And yeah, sometimes there are moments where you're like, yeah, we're going to work on this event, and no, I'm not going to organize a bunch of people chain themselves to the White House fence. That is getting us nowhere. I'm going to work on this janitors march, or I'm going to work on this poor people's campaign over here, because there's vets involved in it, and it's way more important to organizing a power base of veterans. I do think that there's a solution to the redeployment of troops after trauma, and that's a right to heal. if if service members had a national right to heal, right? If once you're diagnosed with trauma, whether that's military sexual trauma, traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress, if that individual had a right to heal, as you would with your civilian job, right? If your doctor at your civilian job said you got a broken leg and you can't go to work, you stay home on disability. But yet, you're if you're in the military, your chain of command can override your doctor. They're supposed to listen to your doctor, but they can override your doctor. It happens all the time. Happened to me when I was in Iraq. My doctors wanted to send me home. My chain of command overrode my doctor. I stayed in Iraq. That's the reality. That's what you deal with as a service member. They treat you as though you have no rights whatsoever. And so that's why organizing service members and veterans as a community, very much in the way that undocumented immigrants have organized their community in that communal sense, in this transformational model and not just a transactional model, is so important. And seeing those lines and seeing those connections has been really important for us. The fact is that we've done a lot already. Can you imagine how big the Iraq War would have been had they been allowed to have a draft and had they had this huge, massive military? Can you imagine how big Iraq would have been had we not had millions of people out on the street on February 15th, 2003, in the largest day of protest in the history of the world? The fact is that people say that the anti-war protests didn't matter or that we failed, and we did have failings, don't get me wrong, but the fact is that we've also had successes. And if we allowed them to have the kind of military that they had in Vietnam or World War II, we would have had the kind of losses and the kind of loss of life that we had in World War II in Vietnam. And the fact that we continuously beat them back every time, and that these wars get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And I very much prescribe to the evolution, not revolution theme, and I very much prescribe to the Dr. King, that the arc of history is long but bends towards justice, and we continuously get a little bit better each time, and that I do believe that we'll get to a point where I think war is obsolete already, and we'll get to the point where we get past war and that war will no longer exist. And I think we're getting to that point because wars are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller because people don't want to deal with it, because people can't deal with what happens in wars, and we keep pushing back against them, and we keep pushing back against them, and we keep pushing back against them, and at some point they will not be able to wage these wars because more and more of us keep pushing back against it. For me, I don't know if I have an overall message to the U.S. or the world. For me, I organize in my community, and if that's here in the district, I work with homeless vets and I work with Iraq Veterans Against the War. And if we continue to work with our communities, and the world becomes better because of the work that we do, not because of what we have to say to it. And there's a lot of talking out there. I hear a lot of talking. I got a TV, I got cable, and I hear a lot of talking. And not a lot of it makes the world much better, but the work that we do does. And that's what really pushes us to that next level. And if we really want to see the world become better, it happens because of the work that we do, the hours that we put in, and the organizing that we do. That's what make things better.